Are you crazy? Let me go! The enraged shout sliced through the holy silence of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Chicago. A wedding meant to be the event of the century instantly became a spectacle nobody expected. 500 members of the elite turned around. They were politicians, business leaders, and the most feared bosses of the criminal world. All of them froze, staring at the unbelievable scene unfolding before them. A maid, her black uniform stained with dirt and her brown hair a mess, was gripping Nico Fontaine's wrist. She was forcefully pulling him down the center of the aisle. Veronica Sterling, the stunning bride in a Vera Wang dress, worth $1 million, turned pale. Then her face flushed with anger. Her shriek was sharp and loud. "Security, drag this crazy person out of here now!" She is mentally unstable. Guards swarmed in from all directions, like wolves catching the scent of their next meal. They were dressed in black suits with cold expressions. They were prepared to handle anyone who would dare ruin their boss's wedding. But the maid did not back down. She held onto Nico even tighter. Her green eyes were filled with tears, but burned with a final desperate fire. "You are in danger. Please, you have to listen to me. Just give me 1 minute." Nico Fontaine, a 36-year-old man with eyes as gray and cold as ice, looked at the maid with a confused expression. This was the woman he had fired just last night. She was a thief and a liar, yet she had the nerve to show up here. She appeared on the most important day of his life, in front of 500 powerful guests. She had truly lost her mind. The guards were so close now, their shadows fell across her. If Nico gave a single nod, the maid would be taken away and disappear from Chicago for good. Nobody ever crossed the Fontaine family and lived an easy life. But there was something in her eyes. It was not craziness or hate, but genuine fear. She was afraid for someone other than herself. Before the guards' rough hands could touch her, Nico suddenly motioned for them to halt. He allowed the maid to lead him toward the coat room next to the aisle. The heavy oak door slammed closed behind them. Outside, 500 people held their breath. Veronica stood frozen in the middle of the church. Her brilliant gown suddenly seemed oddly out of place. She desperately wanted to bang on the door and rush inside, but she was too afraid. The look in Nico's eyes, right before he vanished behind the door, sent a chill down her spine. 1 minute went by, then 2, then 5. A frightening quiet fell over the entire cathedral. Then the whispering started, spreading like a ripple in water. What was going on in there? Who was that maid? What information did she possess that made her risk everything? And what would be revealed when that door finally opened? Nobody realized that in those few minutes, the destiny of a powerful empire was about to be completely changed. This is a story about a woman who had nothing but her courage. She was humiliated, kicked, and thrown away like trash. But she held a secret that could destroy a billion-dollar empire. And when the moment came, she did not run. She fought back. This story will remind you that true strength does not come from money or power. It comes from the heart of someone brave enough to stand up when everyone else stays silent. If you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever been treated like you do not matter, this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end, because the truth behind that closed door will leave you speechless. It all started 48 hours before with the sound of a teacup breaking. 48 hours before the grand wedding, the Fontaine estate was peaceful. It sat on the edge of Chicago like an ancient castle from a different time. It had tall gray stone walls, stained glass windows that shone in the afternoon sun, and a huge garden with a marble fountain. The entire place gave off an air of wealth that normal people could only imagine. But hidden behind that perfect surface were dark secrets that the light could not touch. The sound of breaking porcelain shattered the quiet of the main living room. A Wedgwood teacup, an antique that cost thousands of dollars, had exploded into tiny pieces. Hot Earl Grey tea spilled across the cold marble floor. It soaked into a Persian rug that was 100 years old and spread toward a pair of bright red Louboutin shoes on the floor. Audrey Shaw was frozen in place. She was a 28-year-old woman with brown hair tied back in a neat braid. Her green eyes were clear, and her pale skin had a blue tint from not getting enough sleep. She had worked as a maid in the Fontaine home for 8 months. This had taught her how cruel the rich could be, but she had never experienced anything like this before. She still held an empty silver tray in her hand. She had not dropped the teacup. She had placed it down gently, just like she always did. It was Veronica Sterling, Nico Fontaine's conceited fiancée, who had knocked it off the table. She had done it with a quick, deliberate movement of her hand. It was a perfectly planned act. Veronica jumped up from the red velvet sofa. A turquoise Valentino dress fit her perfect body like a glove. Her lovely face, with its full red lips and shiny blonde hair, was twisted into an angry expression. But Audrey saw the truth. Behind those cold blue eyes, there was no real anger. There was only satisfaction. It was the cruel happiness of someone who loved to crush other people. "You disgusting little maid!" Veronica shouted. Her high-pitched voice echoed in the large room. "Do you have any idea what these shoes are worth? It is more than your pathetic salary for a whole year. How will you ever pay me back with that skinny, ugly body of yours?" Audrey looked down, pressing her lips together so hard they started to bleed. She wanted to explain that she was not at fault. She wanted to say that Veronica was the one who knocked over the cup, but no one would believe a maid. In the corner, Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper who had served the Fontaines for over 30 years, stood like a statue. She had witnessed the whole thing. She knew that Veronica had done it on purpose, but she just lowered her head and looked away, not daring to say anything. In this house, Veronica Sterling had almost total control. She was soon to be the lady of the manor. Nobody dared to oppose her. "Neil," Veronica's voice was like ice, cutting through Audrey's thoughts. "Clean it up using your hands. Use the white cloth from your apron pocket." Audrey looked up at her, her green eyes wide with shock at the command. But Veronica's cold, menacing stare did not change. Audrey slowly got down on her knees. They landed in the warm puddle of tea. Sharp pieces of the broken cup cut into her skin through the thin material of her uniform. She took out the white cloth, leaned over, and started to wipe Veronica's red shoes. Then, a sudden kick to her shoulder sent her stumbling forward. She almost fell completely. It was the sharp point of Veronica's high heel. It had dug into her collarbone. "Scrub harder," Veronica hissed, her voice filled with enjoyment. "And keep your cheap, filthy smell of poverty away from my things. Do you know your own worth? You are not even worth as much as my fingernail." Audrey bit down on her lip, swallowing all of her shame. She pictured Tommy, her 16-year-old brother, lying in a bed at the University of Chicago Medical Center. He had a heart problem that had affected him his whole life. The doctors said he needed an operation that would cost $200,000. $200,000 was a huge amount of money that Audrey had no way of getting. This job at the Fontaine Mansion was her only source of money. If she lost this job, Tommy would have no hope of survival. She could not lose her job. She had to do it, even if it meant giving up her dignity, even if it meant kneeling before someone else. Silent tears ran down her face, mixing with the cooling tea on the floor. Audrey was not crying because of the pain. She was crying because she felt powerless. She cried because of the cruel twist of fate that put her in this position. She knew this was just the start of her nightmare. The sound of heavy footsteps came from the hall. They were steady and firm, like the beating of a heart that had turned to stone long ago. Audrey was still on her knees, on the floor. The white cloth in her hand was now brown from the tea. Her knees hurt from the cuts of the broken china. When she heard the footsteps, her heart grew tight with fear. Nico Fontaine entered the sitting room. He was 36 years old and 6 feet 1 inch tall. He wore a perfect black Tom Ford suit and looked like he came from the pages of a fashion magazine. His face had sharp, clean features, a strong jaw, and a straight, high nose. It gave him a cold and handsome look, but it was his gray eyes that made people afraid. They were icy and distant, and deep inside them was a sadness that no one could ever understand. He was the leader of the Fontaine family, one of the most powerful groups in Chicago. In the criminal world, the name Nico Fontaine stood for total authority. Nobody would dare to oppose him. Nobody would dare to cross him. And nobody would dare to look him in the eye for too long. Nico's gaze took in the scene before him. His fiancée was standing there, her anger like a crown on her head. The maid was on her knees on the floor, surrounded by spilled tea and broken porcelain. The valuable Persian rug was stained. The bright red Louboutin shoes were lying on the floor. It was a messy situation he did not care to understand. Then something amazing happened. Veronica Sterling, the woman who had just been yelling like an evil witch, suddenly changed. She became a weak and helpless princess. She rushed over to Nico, her heels making a clicking sound on the stone floor. She held onto his arm. She rested her head on his chest, her blue eyes filling with tears and her lips starting to tremble. Tears threatened to spill. Nico, my love. Veronica's voice dripped with honey, a stark contrast to the venom she used just moments ago. I only asked her to fetch my tea, and she threw it on the shoes you gave me. My favorite pair. I am so distraught. This feels like a terrible sign for our wedding tomorrow. Audrey remained on the floor, her green eyes wide as she watched the lie unfold. She wanted to object. She wanted to shout that it was not true, but her throat felt tight, and the words would not come. Nico glanced down at the maid kneeling before him. His gray eyes swept over her as if she were a piece of furniture. He never asked for her side of the story. He never looked for the truth in her eyes. He simply felt an overwhelming exhaustion. Tomorrow was his wedding. It was the day he would finally lay to rest the memory of Kate, his first wife, who had passed 2 years before from a sudden heart problem. He did not want more complications. He just wanted peace. Get out. Nico's words landed in the room with the cold finality of a judge's sentence. Do not cause any more problems. Next time, do your job correctly or find another one. There was no question, no look of concern. He did not even wait for an explanation. He turned, allowing Veronica to take his arm, and walked toward the stairs as if the kneeling maid was completely invisible. Audrey felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if from a knife. Veronica's cruelty was one thing, but Nico's indifference was 100 times worse. He was not unkind. He did not torment her like Veronica. Instead, he treated her like she was nothing, like a ghost. She was not worth a single moment of his time. That was the deepest cut of all. Being mistreated meant you still existed. Being completely ignored made you feel like you were nothing at all. Yes, Mr. Fontaine. Audrey lowered her head, her voice barely a whisper. She forced herself to stand on trembling knees, the cuts from the broken porcelain bleeding through her black uniform. She gathered the silver tray, kept her gaze down, and hurried from the room. She did not dare to look back. She would not let them see the tears streaming down her face. Humiliation burned inside her like a fever, but she had to endure for Tommy, for his $200,000 surgery. She did not have the luxury of falling apart. She had no idea that in a few hours her life would be thrown into a storm she could never escape. Audrey moved through the mansion's long, empty hall, her legs feeling heavy as stone. The old portraits on the walls seemed to stare down at her with cold judgment. Pale yellow lights threw eerie shadows on the polished marble floor. The shame still seared her chest, but she bit her lip and forced it all down for Tommy. She had to stay strong for him. As she walked past the ground floor library, Audrey slowed to a halt. The massive oak door was slightly ajar, and a familiar voice slipped through the opening. It was Veronica Sterling, but her tone was no longer sweet. It was not weak or helpless. Now it was cold, victorious, and so full of malice it made her skin crawl. Audrey knew she should not listen. It was a strict rule in the house. Getting caught would mean losing her job immediately. But something in that voice held her in place, a gut feeling she could not ignore. She slid into a dark alcove, her back pressed against the cold wall, and held her breath. He is still completely fooled by me. Veronica's voice was sharp with disdain. Do not worry, the old man is an idiot. He just wallows in grief, lost in memories of his dead wife. It is pathetic. Audrey stopped, breathing completely. An old man. Was Veronica talking about Nico Fontaine? The same man she had called my love only minutes before. Do not worry, baby, Veronica's voice continued, the sweetness now sounding twisted. After we get back from our trip, he will have the same fate as Kate. Then nothing will stand in our way. Audrey's heart seized in her chest. The same fate as Kate. Kate Fontaine, Nico's first wife, had died 2 years ago from what everyone called a sudden heart attack. All of Chicago knew the sad story. They said Nico had been destroyed by her death, becoming the cold, distant man he was today. But what did the same fate as Kate really mean? The inheritance documents are all prepared, Veronica said with satisfaction. My lawyer has taken care of everything. I just need him to sign them tonight, and it will be official. He trusts me completely. He trusts me without question. A soft, chilling laugh followed. Do not worry, baby. I have the medicine. This new type leaves a single trace. An autopsy would find nothing. A couple more doses, and he would simply go to sleep forever. The same way his wife did. Audrey covered her mouth, stifling a horrified gasp. The words hit her like stones. Medicine. No trace. Sleep forever. It was just like Kate. Oh, God. Kate Fontaine did not have a heart attack. She was murdered, and Veronica Sterling was her killer. Then it will all be yours, my love. Veronica's voice softened, a lover's whisper full of poison. The entire Fontaine empire will belong to us. All the money, all the power. We just have to be patient. I will take my time after the wedding. No one will ever know. A young widow, devastated by her husband's tragic death. Who could possibly suspect her? A cruel laugh echoed in the room. Audrey trembled, her entire body shaking as her world tilted. The woman whose shoes she had just cleaned on her hands and knees was a monster. She had murdered Kate Fontaine. Now she was going to kill Nico Fontaine, the same man who had dismissed Audrey with such cold indifference. He would go to his grave never knowing the truth. He was sharing a bed with his own executioner, believing it was love. Suddenly, the sharp click of high heels echoed from the library. Veronica was walking toward the door. Panic seized Audrey. If Veronica found her, she was dead. She knew everything. Veronica would silence her forever. Audrey spun around and fled toward the kitchen. Her feet slipped on the polished marble floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs, threatening to explode. She fell once, her knee striking the hard ground with a searing flash of pain. But she could not stop. She scrambled back to her feet and ran. The dark hallway felt like a tunnel with no end. The shadows seemed to reach for her. Her own ragged breaths sounded like a storm in her ears. Finally, she saw the kitchen door. Audrey threw herself inside, slammed it closed, and leaned her weight against it, fighting for air, against the wall, fighting for breath like she had just run for her life. Her entire body was trembling. The words she had overheard played over and over in her head, a repeating nightmare. Kate was murdered. Nico was next. And she, a simple maid, was the only one who knew. What could she do? Who could she tell? Who would believe a maid? That was just what Veronica had said. Audrey had just stumbled into the kitchen when she nearly ran into someone. She jumped back, her heart still hammering in her chest. It was Maggie Torres, a 35-year-old Hispanic woman with dark curly hair, pulled back, and kind brown eyes. Maggie was Audrey's closest friend among the staff in her 8 months at the Fontaine mansion. Maggie had just put down a stack of plates, her eyes growing wide with alarm as she looked at Audrey. "Audrey, what is wrong? My God, your face is completely white. You look like you just saw a ghost." Audrey could not form words. She grabbed Maggie's arm and pulled her into the darkest part of the huge kitchen, behind a wall of tall shelves. She wanted to be as far from the door as possible. Maggie followed without resisting, her expression a mix of confusion and alarm. When they were hidden from view, Audrey finally turned, her green eyes still wild with fear. She gripped Maggie's shoulders, her voice a shaky whisper. "Maggie, I heard something terrible." It was Veronica. She was on the phone. Audrey recounted everything she had heard, word for word. She told her about Nico being called an idiot. She described the truth about Kate's staged death. She explained the untraceable medicine. She revealed the entire plot to take over the Fontaine Empire after Nico was gone forever. Maggie stood there, frozen like a statue, her brown eyes getting wider with every horrifying detail. Maggie's hand flew up to cover Audrey's mouth as her eyes darted around the room in a panic. "Are you insane? Keep your voice down. If anyone hears you, we are both finished," Maggie hissed. "But are you certain? You heard her correctly? There was no mistake? I heard every word, Maggie." Audrey shook her head, her own voice thick with despair. "She said she would do it after the honeymoon. She has the poison. It is all planned." "Maggie, that woman is a monster. She did away with Mrs. Kate, and now the boss is next." Maggie's body shook, her back hitting a shelf as if her legs could no longer support her. "What can we possibly do? Who could we tell? No one would ever believe us." She looked at Audrey, her eyes filled with a crushing helplessness. "We are just maids, Audrey. 2 maids, and this is the Fontaine family, the most powerful crime family in Chicago. If we make an accusation and are wrong, we die. If we are right but have no proof, we die. We die either way. Do you see?" Audrey saw. She saw it more clearly than anyone. The world was not a just place. The word of a servant was worthless against the word of a beautiful, high society woman poised to become the lady of the house. Just then, the sharp click of high heels echoed from outside the kitchen. Click, click, click. The sound was steady, clear, and coming closer. Audrey and Maggie instantly went silent. The blood in their veins turned to ice. They did not have to see to know who it was. Both women scrambled behind a tall set of shelves, trying to make themselves invisible. The kitchen door swung open. Veronica Sterling entered, dressed in the same breathtaking turquoise Valentino gown. She walked directly to the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of water, twisted the cap, and took a small drink. Then she paused. Her cold blue eyes scanned the kitchen, as if she sensed something, as if she knew they were there. Audrey stopped breathing. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure Veronica could hear it. Maggie was trembling beside her, both hands pressed tightly over her mouth. 1 second passed, then 2, then 3. Time seemed to freeze. At last, Veronica shrugged, placed the bottle on the counter, and walked out. The sound of her heels grew fainter and fainter until it vanished. Audrey and Maggie let out their breath at the same time, their bodies going limp from the release of tension. Maggie grabbed Audrey's hand, her whisper urgent and firm. "We need proof, Audrey. Real, undeniable proof. Without it, our words are nothing. Words are not enough to bring down someone like Veronica Sterling. Do you understand?" Audrey nodded. She understood. But where could they find proof? How could they possibly get it? And who would ever help them? Later that night, the Fontaine mansion was swallowed by a frightening, breathless darkness. Lying on her narrow bed in the basement servants' quarters, Audrey stared wide-eyed at the ceiling. The words she had overheard that afternoon replayed endlessly in her mind. A poison that leaves no sign, a permanent sleep, just like Kate. She tossed and turned, but sleep would not come. Finally, she gave up and rose from her bed. Perhaps a short walk would settle her nerves. Audrey slipped on a light sweater, eased her door open, and stepped into the hall. At night, the Fontaine estate had a haunted sort of beauty, entirely different from how it looked in the daylight. The long corridors were lit by only a few dim lamps that threw strange, dancing shadows on the walls. The sound of her own footsteps was a soft whisper against the cold stone floor. As she passed through the main hall, on the ground floor, Audrey stopped short. A small figure with hair as white as snow was standing motionless in front of a large painting. It was Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper who had served the Fontaines for over 30 years. The same woman who had watched Audrey's humiliation that afternoon and said nothing at all. Audrey began to turn away, but a strong sense of curiosity held her in place. She had to see what Mrs. Patterson was looking at. Moving closer, she saw it was the portrait of a young woman. Her hair was blonde, the color of sunlit wheat. Her eyes were a gentle blue, like a lake in autumn. A warm smile seemed to illuminate the entire canvas. Kate Fontaine, Nico Fontaine's deceased wife, the woman Veronica Sterling had killed. You heard it as well, did you not, child? Mrs. Patterson's sudden voice made Audrey jump. The older woman did not turn around, her eyes remaining fixed on the painting. "I saw you running down the hall this afternoon. I saw the terror on your face. You overheard something from Miss Veronica." Audrey was frozen, unsure of what to say. Lying could get her killed. Telling the truth could get her killed. But Mrs. Patterson did not seem to expect an answer. She let out a long sigh, her voice heavy with the sorrow of someone who has carried a burden for too long. "I know, child. I have known about Veronica for a very long time, about what she did to Kate, about her current plans." The old woman turned, her eyes still sharp, as she looked directly at Audrey. "Before she died, Mrs. Kate was suspicious. She told me she felt sick every time after taking supplements from Dr. Harris, the private family physician. She felt exhausted, dizzy, and her heart would race. But the doctor always said it was just because she was working too much." Mrs. Patterson looked back up at the portrait, her expression softening with sadness. "She was a clever woman, my Kate." She sensed that something was wrong. She wrote down all her suspicions in a letter and hid it. She said that if anything happened to her, I needed to find the antique music box. It was the wedding gift Mr. Nico gave her. "A music box?" Audrey asked, her voice just a whisper. Mrs. Patterson nodded. "An old wooden one, carved with roses. Mr. Nico commissioned it from a craftsman in Italy just for Mrs. Kate. It plays Claire de Lune, her favorite song, the one they first danced to as husband and wife. She sighed. After Kate's death, Mr. Nico moved all of her things to a storage room on the third floor. He ordered that no one was to touch them. The music box is there, with everything else. Mrs. Patterson reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass key, its surface dulled by age. She pressed it into Audrey's hand. I have kept this key for 2 years. 2 years of being silent and afraid. I am too old, my dear. I am too old and too scared to do what needs to be done. Her gaze on Audrey shimmered with something like hope. But you still have a fire in you. I saw it when you knelt to clean Veronica's shoes without shedding a tear. I saw it in the way you ran down the hall with purpose, not defeat. You have what I have lost. Courage. Audrey glanced down at the key in her palm, her heart beating erratically. This was a real clue. This could be the proof that she and Maggie so desperately needed, but it was also a path that could lead directly to her own death. That storage room was forbidden. The Fontaine family did not tolerate trespassers. If she were discovered, she would not just be fired. She would be eliminated. Then she pictured Nico Fontaine, the man with eyes that held a bone-deep sadness. The man who lost his wife, never knowing she was murdered, and who was now about to be killed by the woman he trusted. He was a cold man, a distant man. He had not stood up for her. But he did not deserve to die. Nobody deserved to die like that. I will find it, Audrey declared, her voice shaky but full of conviction. I have to. 2 in the morning. The Fontaine mansion was submerged in a terrifying, dark silence. The only sounds were the faint whistle of the wind against the windows and the frantic pounding of Audrey's heart in her chest. She stood at the base of the staircase that led to the 3rd floor. The old brass key was clenched in her sweaty hand. This was a forbidden zone. After Kate Fontaine died, Nico Fontaine had ordered that no one was ever to go up there. Disobeying that order meant death. Audrey took a shaky breath, willing her body to be still. She thought of Tommy in his hospital bed. She thought of Mrs. Patterson's hopeful eyes. She thought of Kate Fontaine, a woman whose murder had been buried in secrets. She began to climb the stairs, one slow, careful step at a time. A cold sweat beaded on her forehead. Every groan from the old wood made her heart threaten to burst from her chest. The darkness was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Finally, she made it to the 3rd floor. The hallway here was even darker than the rest of the house. Not a single light was on. A thick coat of dust on the floor proved that no one had walked here in a very long time. Audrey turned on the flashlight on her phone, its frail beam cutting through the ancient gloom. The door to Kate's storage room was at the far end of the hall. It was a heavy oak door with an antique wood grain. Audrey crept toward it, inserted the key into the lock, and twisted. The shriek of old metal against wood echoed in the dead silence, making her recoil. She pushed the door open, slipped inside, and quickly pulled it closed behind her. The room that unfolded before her was like a different world, one completely frozen in time. Dust was so thick that she could see particles dancing in her flashlight beam. All the furniture was covered in white sheets, standing like silent ghosts guarding the memories of a dead woman. Audrey swept the light across the room until it landed on a wedding photograph on the wall. Kate Fontaine was in a brilliant white dress, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, her blue eyes radiant with joy. And next to her was Nico Fontaine. But it was not the Nico Fontaine that Audrey knew. The man in the picture was smiling a genuine smile, full of warmth and love. His gray eyes were not cold, but filled with a deep joy. They were looking at each other as if they were the only two people in the world. Audrey's heart ached. This was the man Nico Fontaine used to be. This was before sorrow consumed him, before Veronica Sterling took the woman he loved. She wiped away a tear, forcing herself to concentrate. She was running out of time. Audrey searched the room from a closet filled with designer dresses that still carried a faint, sweet perfume to the vanity drawers filled with sparkling jewelry. A shelf held romance novels with folded pages, but there was no music box. She checked under the table, behind the drapes, and in the nightstand. Nothing. Time was ticking away. Every second she spent in this room was a risk. Finally, Audrey got on her knees and aimed her flashlight under the bed. The beam cut through a dark corner, and then she saw it. A dusty, old wooden trunk. She pulled it out, her hands trembling, as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside were small treasures, photos, love letters, and nestled in a corner, wrapped in crimson velvet, was the music box. Audrey carefully lifted it out. It was an antique wooden box, covered in rose carvings, so detailed they seemed real. The wood was dark from age, but it still possessed a noble and elegant beauty. She opened the lid. The soft, mournful notes of Claire de Lune filled the silent night. The music sounded like the tears of someone lost, a story of a love that was cruelly stolen. Then Audrey noticed it. Tucked beneath the velvet lining was a folded letter and a small, silver memory stick. Audrey took out the letter, her hand shaking so much she could barely open it. She held the flashlight over it and began to read. My dearest Nico, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. I am so sorry I did not tell you this sooner. I was scared and I was not sure. Veronica is not who she appears to be. I saw her with another man. They call him the Fox. I overheard them planning something awful. Dr. Harris has been giving me supplements that are making me weaker each day. I think they are poisoning me. I have recorded what I could on this drive. Please, my love, be careful. Do not let her hurt you, too. I will love you for all time. Yours forever, Kate. Tears fell onto the page, smudging the ink of the dead woman's words. Audrey wept. She wept for Kate Fontaine, who knew her life was ending, but still worried only for her husband. She wept for Nico Fontaine, who lost his great love without knowing why. And she wept for herself, a simple maid holding a secret that could destroy everything. She finally had proof. The letter and the memory stick were weapons that could bring down Veronica Sterling. But she had to get out of this room first. Audrey quickly folded the letter and put it in her inside pocket with the memory stick. Her heart was out of control, her hands shaking so hard she almost dropped the music box. She placed it back in the trunk, slid the trunk under the bed, and stood up to leave. In that precise instant, the lights flashed on. The sudden brightness forced Audrey to squeeze her eyes shut. When she opened them again, her heart fell. Veronica Sterling was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame, with a look of pure victory. She was wearing a blood-red silk robe, her blonde hair falling over her shoulders, her icy blue eyes fixed on Audrey. Well now, Veronica's voice was a slow, menacing drawl. What do we have here? A little mouse sneaking around where she does not belong. Audrey stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the bed. She fought to keep her expression neutral, but her heart was pounding loud enough for Veronica to hear. Miss Veronica. Veronica walked into the room, her heels clicking against the dusty floorboards. Her eyes scanned the space, noting the trunk under the bed and the fresh disturbances in the dust, before landing on Audrey's pale face. What were you searching for, little mouse? Veronica's voice became sickeningly sweet. Who do you think you are? Coming into this room. Do you not know it is forbidden? Audrey struggled to swallow, her own voice unsteady. I I was lost. I could not sleep, so I was just walking, and I got turned around. Veronica cut her off with a sharp, cold laugh that echoed in the silence. Lost? At 2 in the morning? Lost inside a locked room on the 3rd floor? Do you really think I am that stupid? She stepped closer, and each step felt like a new threat. She closed the distance until she was standing right over Audrey, her cold eyes looking down with pure disdain. What are you hiding? Veronica's voice was like a blade. Before Audrey could respond, she lunged forward and grabbed her by the collar. Veronica's hands were on her immediately, searching the pockets of her apron. Fingers tipped with blood-red nails dug into every fold, looking for something out of place. Audrey held her breath. The evidence was in her inner pocket, not the apron. If she just missed that one spot. After a moment, Veronica found nothing. She released Audrey, but her eyes were still narrow with rage and suspicion. You are playing a game, Veronica hissed. I do not know what it is, but I will find out. You think a dirty little maid can outsmart me? Audrey kept her head down and remained silent. She understood that any word she spoke would only make things worse. Veronica stood there, her cold eyes studying Audrey, as if deciding what to do with her. Then, a cruel smile spread across her face, making Audrey's blood run cold. You know, it does not matter what you were looking for. Veronica's voice was frighteningly calm. I just need to get rid of you. You are in a forbidden part of the house. That is all the reason I need to have you removed. Not just from this house, but from Chicago. She pulled a phone from her robe and dialed a number as casually as if she were ordering food. Audrey wanted to run, to grab the phone, to scream for help, but she was frozen. Any sudden move would prove her guilt. Nico, darling. Veronica's voice immediately became soft and fragile, the familiar act falling perfectly into place. I am so sorry to wake you, but you need to come to Kate's room. Something has happened. I found a little mouse snooping around in here. She hung up and gave Audrey a triumphant smirk. Now we wait, little mouse. Let us see how your employer deals with you. Heavy footsteps echoed up the stairs. Nico Fontaine appeared at the door. His handsome face was tight with exhaustion and annoyance at being woken up. He had on a wrinkled white shirt, his dark hair was a mess, and his gray eyes were bloodshot from a lack of sleep. Behind him stood Finn O'Brien, his bodyguard, an Irishman of about 40 with a powerful frame and a cold, emotionless expression. Nico's eyes swept the room and landed on Audrey. The maid was standing there trembling, her face completely pale, her green eyes wide with terror. You! Nico's voice was sharp and furious. You, again? You dared to enter this room. Before Audrey had a chance to say anything, Veronica rushed to Nico's side like a frightened bird. She clung to his arm, her blue eyes looking red and tearful, her lips trembling with fake fear and shock. Nico! Veronica's voice was a fragile whisper, expertly crafted to inspire pity. I heard a strange sound, so I came to see what was wrong. I found this girl going through Kate's possessions. She was searching for something. Nico, I believe she's stealing. Audrey wanted to scream that it was all a lie, but her throat felt like it was clamped shut. No words would come out. She watched Veronica's perfect act unfold and felt a crushing wave of despair. Stealing! Nico's expression hardened, his voice laced with disgust. You would dare to steal from my wife. No, I didn't, Audrey managed to say. But Veronica spoke over her. Check her pockets, Nico, Veronica suggested, her tone dripping with false sincerity. Kate's diamond necklace is gone, the one you gave her for your anniversary. It's not in the jewelry box. See if she has it. Nico gave a sharp nod to Finn. The bodyguard moved toward Audrey, his face an unreadable mask. I am sorry, Finn said flatly before he started to search her. Audrey stood frozen as her heart pounded against her ribs. She had the letter and the USB hidden in an inside pocket, deep beneath the fabric. If Finn only checked her apron, she might be safe. But then the worst possible thing happened. As Finn searched her apron pocket, a glittering object fell to the floor with a sharp metallic sound. It was a diamond necklace. Audrey stared down at it, her eyes wide with shock. She had not taken it. She did not even know where it was kept. But there it was, fallen from her own pocket. Veronica. When Veronica had patted down Audrey's apron moments before, she wasn't looking for anything. She was planting the necklace. The trap had been laid, and Audrey had walked straight into it. "I did not take it," Audrey cried out, her voice raw with panic. "I did not take it. She put it there. Please, you must believe me." But Nico wasn't listening. His gray eyes were fixed on Audrey, filled with cold disappointment and utter contempt. He bent down and picked up the necklace, his thumb brushing over the diamonds. He held it as if touching a memory of his late wife. "I gave you an opportunity to work here." Nico's voice was low and heavy. Every word was a weight pressing down on her. "I overlooked the incident with the tea, and you repay me by stealing from my wife and entering a room I told you to stay out of." "Mr. Fontaine, please just listen," Audrey begged, tears streaming down her face. "I am not a thief. I came in here to find something important. You are in danger." She pointed a trembling finger at Veronica. "She is going to kill you, just like she killed Kate." A deep silence filled the room. Nico stood completely still, and for a moment, an unreadable emotion flickered in his gray eyes. Veronica shattered the quiet with a soft, pitying laugh. "The poor girl," Veronica said, her voice a sweet poison of false sympathy. "She has lost her mind. She is inventing stories to avoid being punished. Nico, do not listen to her. She is just a common thief." Nico's gaze fell on Audrey for another moment before he turned his back to her. His shoulders tensed, and his hand tightened around the necklace. "Get her out," he said. His voice was cold as ice, completely empty of feeling. "Make sure she never gets a job in this city again. The Fontaine family does not tolerate traitors." Finn nodded and moved to grab Audrey's arm. She pulled away. She fought him. She tried to shout one last warning. "Please listen to me. Kate was murdered. You are next. She left evidence. You have to—" But her words were ignored. Finn dragged her from the room, down the grand staircase, and through the long, shadowed hallways. Audrey continued to shout, to plead, but it was useless. She was just a maid. Her voice meant nothing in a world run by powerful men. The massive iron gates of the Fontaine property swung open and then crashed shut behind her. The sound echoed into the night. Audrey was left in the darkness at 3 in the morning. She had no money, no phone, and nowhere to go. She had only the clothes she was wearing, and a heart heavy with despair. Then she reached into her hidden pocket. The letter was there. The USB was safe. Veronica had won this fight, but the war was not over. The Chicago wind felt like 1,000 small knives against Audrey's skin. She walked down an empty street, her thin shoes already soaked with dew. She had nothing. No money, no phone, and no home. But inside her pocket, she carried Kate's letter and the small drive. It was the evidence that could save a man who was unknowingly sleeping next to his enemy. Audrey walked for almost an hour through the dark city streets. She moved from the rich neighborhoods with their stunning mansions to the working-class areas with their old, crowded apartment buildings. She had only one destination left. It was Maggie Torres's tiny apartment. It was on the 4th floor of a decaying building with cracked stairs and a constant smell of dampness. Audrey forced her aching legs to climb each step. She knocked on the door. At 4 in the morning, Maggie answered, dressed in wrinkled pajamas, with her dark hair in a tangled mess. Her eyes were still heavy with sleep, but when she saw Audrey, She was instantly alert. "Oh my God," Maggie exclaimed, pulling her friend inside. "What happened? You look like you were in an accident. Your face is completely pale, and your lips are blue from the cold. Get in here, now." Audrey collapsed onto the worn-out sofa in Maggie's small living room. Maggie wrapped her in a wool blanket and handed her a mug of hot tea. Audrey then explained everything. She told her about breaking into Kate's room, finding the music box with the letter, and Veronica catching her. She described the perfectly executed trap, the diamond necklace falling from her pocket, and Nico's cold fury as he had her thrown out. After Audrey finished her story, Maggie just sat there in shocked silence. Her face was pale. "That witch," Maggie whispered through clenched teeth. "She planned to frame you all along." Audrey nodded, then took the letter and the USB out of her pocket. "But I have this, the proof that Mrs. Kate left. Biscuita. We have to see what is on this drive," Maggie said. She got her old laptop, inserted the USB, and opened the contents. The screen displayed a folder containing several files. The first one was a video. Kate Fontaine had recorded it from a secret location. The video showed Veronica Sterling kissing a man Audrey did not recognize. He was tall, with black hair and a prominent scar down his left cheek. They were speaking quietly, their words unclear, but it was obviously not an innocent conversation. The next file was an audio recording. It was Dr. Harris, the Fontaine family's private doctor, speaking very clearly. "The dose for Mrs. Kate has to be increased. She's becoming suspicious. We need to speed things up." The rest of the files were images. There were receipts for chemicals bought from a drug company. There were also text messages between Veronica and a man she called Baby. The messages said that everything was moving forward as planned, and that soon they would have everything. Maggie's hands shook as she looked through the files. Her face turned as white as a sheet. This is real. Mrs. Kate was murdered. It was not a heart attack. She was poisoned. And Veronica was the one who did it. "We have to take this to the police," Maggie said, her voice filled with urgency, but Audrey just shook her head. Her eyes were tired but focused. "We cannot. The Fontaine family has half of the Chicago police in their pocket. They would bury this evidence before anyone could see it. Veronica would know right away and destroy everything." "Then what do we do?" Maggie asked, her voice breaking with fear. Audrey looked out the window. The black sky was slowly turning to gray as the first signs of dawn appeared. The wedding was scheduled for that afternoon, less than 12 hours from now. "I have to get this evidence directly to Nico," Audrey said, her voice surprisingly calm. "At the wedding." Maggie looked at her as if she had gone mad. "Are you insane? You will never make it past security. You are fired. They know your face. They will stop you the moment you get near the church." "I know," Audrey replied, her green eyes burning with resolve. "But I have to try. It is his only chance. If I do nothing, Nico Fontaine will die. And I cannot let that happen." Audrey did not sleep. She remained on the old sofa in Maggie's apartment, staring at the laptop screen. She watched the evidence Kate Fontaine left behind over and over. With each viewing, she saw something new. She saw the look of victory, Veronica's eyes when she kissed the other man. She heard the cold, clinical tone of Dr. Harris's voice as he discussed the dosage. She read the hidden meanings in the messages about the plan and our future. Kate knew. She knew she was dying, and she tried to leave a warning for her husband, but Nico never saw it. Now, 2 years later, the same thing was about to happen again. Audrey gazed out the window at the dark sky. She thought about her brother, Tommy, in his hospital bed. He had no idea his sister had just been fired, framed, and left on the street. He was a 16-year-old boy with a weak heart, waiting for a life-saving operation. The $200,000 she needed for it now seemed more impossible to get than ever. If something happened to her tomorrow, who would look after Tommy? Who would handle the medical bills? Who would be there for him when he was scared? But if she did nothing, Nico Fontaine would die. He was an innocent man. He would die at the hands of the one person he trusted completely. And Veronica Sterling, the woman who killed, would walk free to enjoy the power and riches she bought with blood. Audrey looked at Maggie's phone on the table. She had to hear Tommy's voice one last time. She picked it up and dialed the hospital. After a couple of rings, Tommy answered, his voice weak, but still filled with his usual cheer. "Audrey? Why are you calling so late? It is only 5 in the morning. Are you all right?" "You sound exhausted." Audrey fought back the lump in her throat and made her voice sound steady. "I am fine, sweetheart. I just finished a late shift. I wanted to hear you, so I called a bit early." "You work too hard," Tommy said, his tone laced with concern. "Do not worry about me. The doctor told me I am improving every single day. Soon, I will be walking around the room. You need to eat well, okay? Do not skip your meals to save money for me." Silent tears streamed down Audrey's face. She forced a smile he could not see. "You are being so brave. I love you, Tommy. No matter what happens, always remember that I love you." "What are you talking about? That sounds strange?" Tommy chuckled. "It sounds like you are going somewhere very far away. I love you too. I will see you soon." "Okay." Audrey's throat closed up, her voice trembling. "Yes, I will see you soon." She hung up the phone and finally let the sobs escape. She wept for Tommy. She wept for herself. She wept for the dark path that lay ahead. Maggie sat next to her in silence, holding her hand. She said nothing because no words could possibly help. As the sun began to rise, Audrey stood. She changed back into the maid uniform Maggie had saved for her, carefully tucking the music box with the letter and the USB into an inside pocket. Maggie watched from the doorway, her brown eyes clouded with worry. She pulled Audrey into a desperate hug, her voice cracking. "Be safe. Please come back to me alive. I will wait for you here." Audrey nodded and hugged Maggie tightly before pulling away. "I will try." She walked out into the early morning, the sunlight hitting her face. Before her was the road to St. Patrick's Cathedral, to the wedding of the century, and to a confrontation that would decide her fate and Nico Fontaine's. St. Patrick's Cathedral stood in the heart of Chicago, a timeless piece of Gothic architecture. Today it was decorated more lavishly than ever, draped in thousands of white flowers and gleaming silver ribbons. The wedding of Chicago's most powerful Mafia boss had captured the city's attention. The streets were clogged with hundreds of luxury cars. A line of Rolls-Royce, Bentley, and Maybach vehicles, each one a small fortune. The security was suffocating. Guards in dark suits were everywhere. Metal detectors were at each entrance, and the guest list was being checked with extreme care, one name at a time. Audrey watched from across the street, concealed by a large tree, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she could not use the main entrance. Her face was known, and her name was on a blacklist. If a guard spotted her, she would be captured instantly. Or worse, she made her way to the back of the cathedral, where a service entrance was used by the staff. Catering trucks were parked outside, with workers moving quickly, carrying in food and drinks. At that moment, a middle-aged woman in a server's uniform rushed by, saw Audrey, and barked at her. "You! Are you the new girl for the service team? What are you doing just standing there? We are incredibly short on staff." "Get inside now," Audrey nodded, schooling her features into a neutral expression. "Yes, I was lost. I did not know which door to use. Come with me." The woman took Audrey's arm and pulled her through the kitchen entrance. Just like that, Audrey was inside the church. Her heart beat like a drum against her ribs, and a cold sweat formed on her brow. The first step was a success, but it was only the beginning. Audrey moved through the busy kitchen, trying to disappear into the crowd of staff. When she reached a side hallway, she froze. Finn O'Brien, Nico's most trusted bodyguard, was patrolling just ahead. Audrey ducked behind a massive stone pillar, holding her breath. Her heart was beating so loudly, she was sure he could hear it. Finn walked past with a steady pace, then he paused. Audrey did not move a muscle. Her entire body turned to stone. Finn scanned the corridor, as if he felt something was out of place. 1 second passed, then 2, then 3. He shrugged and continued on his way. Audrey let out a shaky breath, her legs so weak they almost gave out. But there was no time for fear. She had to move. Audrey crept down the side corridor, heading for the main hall. She could hear the sounds of classical music. She could hear the low hum of hundreds of guests. She was getting close. Suddenly, the door in front of her opened. Audrey had no time to react as Veronica Sterling walked out. She was stunning in a white wedding gown, her bridesmaids following in dresses of pale pink. Audrey immediately turned her face away, pretending to clean a picture on the wall. Her heart felt like it had stopped. If Veronica saw her, it was over. Veronica passed by, leaving a light scent of expensive perfume in the air. She was laughing and chatting with her bridesmaids, her voice full of happiness and victory. She never even glanced at Audrey. She did not recognize the dirty maid she had discarded the night before. Once the footsteps faded, Audrey dared to breathe again. Her pulse was racing, and her limbs were trembling, but she forced herself onward. Finally, Audrey made it to the cathedral's main hall. She found a spot in a dark corner, behind a pillar, and looked out at the scene. 500 guests from high society sat in long pews covered in red velvet. There were politicians, corporate leaders, and powerful figures from the criminal underworld. All of them were dressed in fine clothes and expensive jewelry to watch the wedding of the century. Flowers were everywhere, candles flickered, and a symphony played soft music. And there, at the front of the altar, stood Nico Fontaine. He was wearing a flawless black suit, his hair perfectly styled. He was as handsome as ever, but his gray eyes were vacant and lifeless, like a man unknowingly walking to his own execution. Audrey touched the music box hidden in her pocket. The letter and the USB were safe inside. The evidence that could save his life was right there. "It is now or never," she whispered to herself. At that moment, the wedding music began to swell. Every guest stood and turned to face the main doors. Veronica Sterling made her entrance, a vision in a $1 million Vera Wang gown. It was pure white, with a train that stretched for meters, covered in thousands of sparkling crystals. She wore a priceless French lace veil and carried a bouquet of white roses. She was a radiant queen arriving in her kingdom. The guests whispered in awe. Cameras flashed. Veronica smiled, a triumphant look from someone who was about to have it all. She walked toward the altar, toward Nico, and toward the bloody future she had planned. Audrey clutched the music box in her pocket. It was time. Veronica Sterling stood next to Nico Fontaine, her white dress shining under the light of the crystal chandeliers. She held out her hand to him, her smile as bright as a queen on her coronation day. Nico took her hand, his expression still empty, like a man in a dream. The elderly priest stood at the altar, his calm, deep voice filling the church. "We are gathered here today, before God and these witnesses, to join together the sacred union of Nico Fontaine and Veronica Sterling in holy matrimony. Audrey remained in the far corner, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would break. She knew time was running out. As soon as the vows were exchanged, once Nico said, "I do," everything would be finished. Veronica would legally become Mrs. Fontaine, and Nico would be a helpless target for his enemy. With no other choice, she began to move. She squeezed between crowded pews, pushing past people who were focused on the altar. She was met with suspicious looks and annoyed whispers. "Who are you? Where do you think you are going? Why are you shoving people?" Audrey ignored them. She kept walking forward, her gaze fixed on Nico's form at the front of the church. The closer she got, the more questioning stares she drew. A few of the guards started to take notice of the strange maid acting so erratically. The priest's voice droned on, slow and steady. "Nico Fontaine, do you take Veronica Sterling to be your lawful wedded wife? To love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Nico opened his mouth to speak. "Stop!" Audrey's scream ripped through the quiet cathedral, bouncing off the high arched ceiling like a clap of thunder. 500 heads spun around at once, 500 sets of eyes staring at the small maid in a black uniform standing in the aisle. Veronica's face turned white, her blue eyes wide with shock. She knew it was Audrey, the little pest she had thrown out last night, the little pest who should have been gone from Chicago. But here she was, standing in the middle of her wedding, in front of 500 powerful guests. Audrey did not hesitate. She ran toward the front, her worn shoes slapping against the marble floor. Guards moved in from all sides like a pack of wolves, but she was quicker. She reached Nico and grabbed his arm, her green eyes locking with his gray ones. A raw and desperate urgency. "Mr. Fontaine, you have to look at this. She will end you, the same way she ended Kate." Nico flinched. His blank expression finally cracked, revealing his shock. "You? What are you doing in this place? Are you out of your mind? Security!" Veronica's shriek was a blade of panic. "Get this lunatic away from here now. She is not well. She is having delusions. Somebody needs to act." Guards moved forward, their strong arms went reaching for Audrey, but she refused to release Nico. She held on tighter and screamed with all the remaining force in her soul. Kate was murdered. Veronica was the one who did it, and she is going to do it to you. I can prove it. The words echoed through the entire cathedral. 500 guests were completely still. No one even breathed. No one knew what they should do. Nico looked at Audrey, and for the first time, his gray eyes were not empty. He saw something in the maid's eyes. It was not the madness Veronica was screaming about. It was not the fantasy of a sick mind. It was pure desperation, a sincerity that went to the bone, and a fire of resolve he had never witnessed in his life. Before the guards could touch her, Audrey used all her strength to pull Nico toward a coat room near the altar. He had no idea why, but some instinct told him to go with her. His legs moved without his command. The coat room door swung open and then slammed shut behind them with a solid thud. Outside, everything descended into chaos. Veronica was screaming like a wild animal. Her lovely face was a mask of rage and terror. The guests began to murmur and shift in their seats. Whispers spread like a tide. Guards hammered on the coat room door, yelling for them to open it. But inside that tiny room, there were only two individuals: Nico Fontaine, the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago, and Audrey Shaw, the maid he had dismissed the previous night. They stood facing each other, breathing hard, the air thick with tension. This was the turning point, the moment that would change everything. The coat room was small, containing just a large mirror, A couple of velvet chairs and the soft light from a single lamp. The noise from outside seemed to recede, leaving only the sound of two people breathing heavily. Audrey gasped for air, her chest heaving, as her trembling hands reached inside her pocket. Nico Fontaine stood before her, his features sharp and cold, his gray eyes burning with anger and disgust. "You have 30 seconds to explain yourself." Nico's voice was quiet. Each word was like a block of ice. 30 seconds before I unlock that door and let my men take you. Why would I trust a thief I just fired? A woman who snuck into my wife's private room. A woman who just destroyed my wedding in front of 500 people. Audrey did not back down from his freezing stare. She had come too far to stop now. She had put everything on the line to be here. She would not fail with the end so close. "You do not need to believe me," Audrey said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You just need to believe Kate." She then took the music box out of her pocket. It was an old wooden box, carved with roses so fine they seemed real. The wood was dark with age, but it was still incredibly beautiful. Nico froze completely. His gray eyes grew wide, and his cold expression finally broke. He knew it instantly. He could never forget it. He had ordered it for Kate from an artisan in Florence, Italy. It was the wedding present he gave her on the best day of their lives. It was the last piece of a love he thought was lost to him. This was Kate's music box. Nico's voice became tight, as if something was closing around his throat. "How did you find this?" "Mrs. Patterson gave me the key," Audrey explained, carefully handing the music box to him. "Kate put something in it for you. She had a feeling she was going to die. She needed you to understand what really happened." Nico took the music box with hands that shook, the same fingers that had pulled triggers without a second thought, that had authorized death warrants in the criminal world, now trembled uncontrollably. He lifted the lid. The soft, sorrowful notes of Claire de Lune filled the small space. The melody was so familiar, it was painful. It was Kate's favorite song. It was the song they had shared their first dance to at their wedding 7 years before. It was the tune he used to hum to help her sleep on nights she felt unwell. Nico was motionless, letting the music surround him like a warm memory. And then he noticed it. Tucked beneath the velvet lining inside the box was a neatly folded letter. He picked it up and knew the handwriting at once. It was Kate's script, gentle and slanted slightly to the right, with little circles over her eyes. He had seen that same writing in countless love notes from when they first met. Nico started to read, and his entire world fell apart. Every line was a knife twisting in his heart. "Veronica is not who you think she is. I saw her with another man. They call him the Fox. Dr. Harris has been giving me medicine that makes me weaker each day. I am certain they are poisoning me." Nico's expression shifted with each sentence. He went from disbelief to shock, from shock to agony, and from agony to a blinding, violent rage. His hand trembled, crumpling the letter in his grasp. Then something unbelievable occurred. Tears streamed down the face of the most heartless mafia boss in Chicago. It was the first time in 2 years, the first time since Kate's death. He did not cry at her funeral. He did not cry as her casket was lowered into the ground. He had become a man of ice, locking away all his emotions. But now the tears flowed freely. "Kate, my love?" Nico's voice broke. It was the cry of a wounded creature. "I am sorry. I am so very sorry." Audrey remained quiet, allowing him a moment for his pain. She took out a phone from her pocket, one she had grabbed from a guest's purse while making her way through the crowd. "And I have this too," she said quietly. "The drive has video and sound. Kate recorded it all." Nico accepted the phone, his hand still unsteady as he opened the video files. He watched Veronica, kissing a man with a scar on his face. They were laughing, discussing their plans for when he was gone. He heard Dr. Harris talking about the right dose for Mrs. Kate. He saw the messages between Veronica and her lover. They were tender words she had never shared with him. Nico collapsed into a velvet chair, burying his face in his hands as his shoulders shook. He had shared a bed with his wife's murderer for 2 years. He was about to marry his mortal enemy. He had been so blind. After a long, agonizing minute of silence, Nico got to his feet. He wiped away his tears, straightened his collar, and smoothed his suit. When he looked up, his gray eyes were transformed. The emptiness of a man lost in sorrow was gone. The coldness of a man who had stopped living was gone. In its place was the sharp focus of a predator zeroing in on its target. It was the terrifying calm of a mafia boss preparing to destroy his foe. He glanced at Audrey, and a spark of gratitude showed deep in his eyes. "Thank you for everything." He then moved toward the exit. The coat room door burst open. Nico Fontaine walked out, his expression like stone, his gray eyes like daggers. Audrey was right behind him, her heart pounding, but she understood the worst was finished. Outside, 500 guests were buzzing with nervous energy, their whispers like a rising tide. The guards stood by the door, waiting for the order to grab the crazy maid. But Nico just walked right past them. Veronica immediately ran to him, her expensive dress flowing behind her, her face a perfect picture of fake worry and fear. "Nico, you are finally out. What did that insane woman tell you? Do not listen to her. She is lying to get back at you for firing her." "My darling, please look at me." Nico did not look at her. He did not give her a single glance. He did not say one word. He walked directly to the front of the church, where the old priest was still standing in confused shock. Nico went to the microphone. His cold eyes scanned the 500 expectant faces. Then he spoke. "The wedding is canceled, effective immediately." Nico's voice was like steel, empty of all emotion and doubt. The 7 words were as heavy as a mountain, and they hit the 500 guests like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. The cathedral fell completely silent. 1 second passed, then 2, then 3. No one made a sound. Then the room erupted. Whispers broke out like a disturbed hive. There were shocked gasps and confused questions. What is going on? Is Fontaine out of his mind? What did that maid tell him? Veronica stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, her face as pale as a ghost. She could not process what. The word shattered the air. The wedding was canceled. This came after 2 years of flawless planning, after she eliminated Kate, after she ensnared Nico with false love, after she had arrived at the very gates of her perfect life. Veronica's voice was a panicked shriek. "Nico, what are you talking about? You cannot do this. We are about to be married. You cannot end our wedding in front of 500 guests." She rushed to him, clutching his arm, her blue eyes glistening with tears. "My love, please, let me explain. The maid is lying to you. She is trying to destroy our happiness. Believe me, not her." Nico ripped his arm from her grasp like it was a viper. His gray eyes locked with hers for the first time since emerging from the back room, and the look in them froze her solid. The cold indifference was gone. Now there was only raw hatred and a deep, unsettling disgust. "Explain what?" Nico's voice was dangerously low. "Tell me how you murdered my wife. Or tell me how you were planning to murder me after our honeymoon." The color fled from Veronica's face. Her legs felt weak. "What are you saying?" Nico turned to his guard, Finn, who stood close by, His voice was empty of all emotion as he gave the order. Get Detective Morrison on the line. Inform him I have evidence regarding the murder of Catherine Fontaine. I have video, audio, and a letter in her own handwriting. I need him here, now. Veronica just stood there, mouth agape, her face a sheet of white paper. She could not process what was happening. How could Nico know? Where did he get proof? Kate had been gone for 2 years. Every single trace was gone. No one could prove a thing. And get the brothers on the phone, Nico added, his tone as casual as if he were talking about the forecast. I need the location of the fox, Derek Lawson. I want it within the hour. Veronica jolted, as if shocked by a live wire. She stared at Nico, horrified. You know about Derek? I do now, Nico answered, his voice colder than ice. Kate left me everything. All of it. The video of you and your lover kissing. The recording of Dr. Harris talking about the poison's dosage. The messages between you and the man you called baby. Everything. Veronica's gaze shifted to Audrey, who was standing right next to Nico. In that single moment, her carefully constructed mask disintegrated. Her angelic face contorted into something monstrous. Her blue eyes blazed with pure hate. Her lips curled in rage, and her entire body trembled with venom. You, Veronica howled, like a cornered beast. This is your fault. You disgusting little maid. I will kill you. She lunged toward Audrey like a predator. Her crimson nails were raised, aimed straight for her enemy's face. But Finn was quicker. The bodyguard stepped in her path, wrapping his arms around her from behind to restrain her. Veronica struggled wildly, her screams sounding completely unhinged. Let me go! Let go of me this instant! I am Nico Fontaine's wife. I am the queen of this city. You can't touch me. You are nobody. You are nothing, Nico said, his voice terrifyingly cold. You are just a murderer who is about to face justice. He looked at Finn. Hold her. The police will arrive in 10 minutes. The 500 guests were frozen in place, watching the shocking drama play out. Phones were already emerging to capture the scene. The wedding of the century was now the arrest of the century, and Veronica Sterling, who had appeared so regaled just moments before, was now a screaming, thrashing criminal in a guard's arms. Amid the chaos in the cathedral, with all eyes on Nico and his stunning accusation, Veronica found an opening. In the brief moment Finn was distracted, she twisted free. She knocked aside another guard and bolted for a rear exit of the church. Her $1 million bridal gown trailed behind her like a white funeral shroud. The countless crystals sewn onto the dress scattered like tiny stars on the marble floor as she fled. She ignored the shouts and screams pursuing her. Her mind had only one command: run. The black limousine was still at the back entrance, waiting to take the newlyweds to their reception. Veronica launched herself inside and yelled at the driver, "The airport. Drive fast. Now. I will give you $1 million if you get me there in 30 minutes." The vehicle sped away like a shot from a gun, leaving St. Patrick's Cathedral and her ruined life behind. In the back seat, Veronica's trembling hands fumbled with the purse she always kept near. Inside was a fake passport for an Emily Carter, a large bundle of cash, and a burner phone. She had always maintained a plan B, just in case her world collapsed. She tore off her veil and her diamond tiara, then struggled within the tight space to shed the massive wedding gown and pull on a simple black coat she had packed. The priceless jewelry was hastily stuffed into a small fabric bag. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight bun. In the mirror's reflection, Veronica Sterling vanished. All that remained was an average woman with a weary face, running for her life. "Just make it to the plane," she whispered, trying to steady her breathing. "Just get to Europe. Derek has contacts in Paris. I can start a new life. I will be okay. The car screeched to a halt at O'Hare. Veronica leaped out, tossed a handful of bills at the driver, and raced into the international terminal. She pushed her way through the crowds, her eyes scanning for any threat. She saw nothing. No security, no police, just ordinary travelers with their bags. A wave of relief washed over her as she approached the Air France desk. The flight to Paris was leaving in 2 hours. She presented the fake passport, her expression carefully neutral. One first-class ticket to Paris, please. The earliest available. The ticketing agent looked at the passport, typed on his keyboard, and then offered a polite smile. Of course, Miss Carter. One moment, please. Veronica waited, her heart pounding, her eyes darting around the terminal. Just get the ticket, get past security, get on the plane, then she would be safe. Where do you think you are going, Veronica? A familiar cold voice spoke from just behind her. Veronica went rigid, her blood turning to ice. She turned slowly and faced her worst nightmare. Nico Fontaine was standing there in his black wedding tuxedo, his gray eyes like chips of frost. Next to him stood Finn O'Brien, and a man in a gray suit she recognized as Detective Morrison from the Chicago Police. Behind them, dozens of uniformed officers were blocking off the entire area. How? Veronica whispered, her face draining of all color. How did you find me? Did you really forget? Nico took a step closer, and each footstep echoed like a funeral bell. I own this city. Every exit from Chicago is watched by my people. The airports, the train stations, the bus terminals. Where did you honestly think you could hide? Veronica stumbled backward until she was pressed against the check-in counter. She forced her signature, seductive smile, her voice becoming sweet and desperate. Nico, my love, you have to let me explain. It is not what it seems. That maid invented everything. I love you. I have only ever loved you. Be quiet. Nico's voice cut through her lies like a razor blade. I have Kate's letter, her audio recordings, and a video of you with your lover planning my death. Dr. Harris confessed everything when the police arrived at his home 20 minutes ago. The game is over, Veronica. Her mask finally shattered for good. The angelic face twisted into a demonic snarl, consumed by pure rage. Her voice was a shrill scream, devoid of any warmth. So what if I did? Kate was a weak fool. She was not worthy of you. She had no idea how to hold on to a man like you. I am the one you need. Everything I did was for us. There was never an us, Nico said, his voice terrifyingly empty. There was only your greed. You do not love me. You love my fortune, my influence, and my company. At that moment, Veronica saw Audrey standing behind Nico, the quiet little maid with the green eyes who had single-handedly destroyed the world she had built over 2 years. A final wave of madness crashed over her. Veronica lunged at Audrey like a rabid animal. Her nails extended like claws, a howl of pure fury tearing from her throat. You, if not for you, I would have it all. I am going to kill you. I will tear you to pieces. Officers swarmed forward immediately, tackling Veronica and pinning her to the ground. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed as they were snapped around her wrists. Veronica was dragged to her feet and hauled away, her face a mess of tears and smeared makeup, her golden hair a ruined tangle. Her black coat was twisted on her shoulders. Her perfect red nails were chipped and broken. The powerful queen was gone. In her place was a desperate criminal, shouting as the law closed in. A crowd had formed in the airport. Phones were raised from every direction, capturing the fall of the woman who almost became Chicago's underworld queen. Veronica screamed Nico's name one final time as officers pulled her toward the police car. You will pay for this. I promise you will pay. Nico did not even turn around. His voice was empty and cold. My only regret is not seeing the truth about you sooner. 3 months. After that day, the trial for Catherine Fontaine's murder concluded. The punishments matched the crimes. Veronica Sterling received a life sentence with no possibility of parole for premeditated murder and conspiracy. When the judge delivered the verdict, she descended into a wild panic, screaming in the courtroom until officers had to drag her away. She continued to shout curses and threats as they removed her. Dr. Warren Harris was given 15 years as an accomplice to murder. His face lost all color as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Derek Lawson, known as the Fox, was apprehended in a joint raid by Fontaine Security and federal agents. He faced a massive list of charges, from conspiracy and murder to money laundering and distributing illegal drugs. The entire city of Chicago was stunned by the case. It dominated the front page of every paper for weeks. They called it The Bloody Wedding, a tale of treachery and justice delivered at the altar. And at the center of the story was a young woman with a new nickname, the Silent Hero. Audrey Shaw, the 28-year-old maid who risked everything to expose Veronica Sterling's plan. The media pursued her relentlessly. News networks wanted her for interviews. Podcasts pleaded for the rights to her story. But Audrey turned them all down. She had no desire for fame. She did not want the spotlight. All she ever wanted was a simple life, away from the chaos and heartache of the wealthy. One afternoon, Audrey visited Tommy at the University of Chicago Medical Center, just as she always did. She was preparing to ask the doctor about her brother's prognosis and how she could possibly find more money for his surgery. But the doctor greeted her with a wide smile, stopping her before she could speak. "Miss Shaw, I have wonderful news. Tommy's surgery is scheduled for next week. The entire cost has been covered." Audrey froze. She was certain she had heard him wrong. $200,000. Who paid for it? The doctor's smile was mysterious. The donation was anonymous. The person who paid asked to remain private. Audrey knew in an instant who it was. There was only one person with that kind of power, and only one person with that kind of motive. Tears streamed down her face, but for once, they were tears of pure joy. The surgery was a complete success. Tommy's recovery was astonishingly fast. The doctors were amazed. A strong new heart was beating inside the chest of a 16-year-old boy. For the very first time, Tommy could run and play just like other kids. Audrey wrapped her arms around her brother, her tears flowing freely. "You are going to be all right, my love. You are finally going to be all right." Across the city, Nico Fontaine was undergoing his own transformation. He established a charity called Kate's Hope Foundation, created to help women and children who were victims of abuse and deception. He put 80% of his personal wealth into the foundation and turned over control of his businesses to Finn and a board of directors. Finn stood in Nico's office, looking at his boss with total disbelief. "Are you serious, boss? You spent 20 years building this, and you are just walking away from it?" Nico gazed out the window. His gray eyes were no longer like ice. They now held a deep sense of peace. "I have been in the dark for too long, Finn. Kate always wanted me to find my way into the light. It is about time I listened." Later that afternoon, Nico stood at Kate's grave in a cemetery on the edge of Chicago. He placed a bouquet of white roses on the marble headstone that bore her name. They had always been her favorite. "I am so sorry I failed to protect you," Nico said, his voice low and heavy with emotion. "I am sorry that I was blind for 2 years, but I uncovered the truth. The person who hurt you has faced justice. And I have met someone who reminds me so much of you, someone with your same strength, your same gentle spirit. She rescued me, Kate, in the same way you once did. A soft breeze drifted through the cemetery, rustling the petals of the white roses. For the first time in 2 years, Nico smiled, feeling as if Kate was answering him from a place far beyond. 6 months passed, and Audrey Shaw's world was unrecognizable. She and Tommy were living in a small, lovely house in a Chicago suburb. It had a garden bursting with flowers and a white picket fence. It was not a grand mansion or a tiny apartment in a rough neighborhood. It was a true home, a place filled with daily laughter. Tommy was healthy and full of life, playing catch in the yard with other kids from the block. A 16-year-old boy with a healthy heart who could finally run and shout and be a normal teenager. Audrey was in the garden, her hands covered in dirt, as she cared for her new rose bushes. A calm smile graced her lips, a smile she never thought she would have after so many years of hardship. The sound of a car engine broke the quiet afternoon. Audrey looked up to see an old green Jeep parked by her front gate. It was not a Rolls-Royce or a Bentley, like the cars at the Fontaine estate. It was a simple, ordinary vehicle. The driver's door opened, and Nico Fontaine got out. But he was not the cold-hearted crime boss in a designer suit anymore. He had on a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a pair of tan pants, and sneakers. His face was tanner now, looking healthier, and his gray eyes, which had once been so cold, now held a warmth Audrey had never seen. "Uncle Nico!" Tommy yelled, running toward him like a blur. The boy hugged Nico Semestun Nico with all the pure happiness a 16-year-old could have. Nico laughed, a genuine laugh, and ruffled the boy's hair. "Hey, kid, how is that new heart treating you?" "It is awesome," Tommy said, his face bright with pride. "I am the fastest kid in my class. The doctor says I am as strong as a bull. Can you play catch with me?" "In a minute," Nico said with a smile. "I need to speak with your sister first." Tommy agreed and ran back to join his friends. Audrey cleaned her hands on her apron and walked out of the garden. Her heart was beating quickly, for a reason she could not quite name. She felt a sudden nervousness she could not explain. Nico came closer, stopping a few feet from her. "Hi," he said quietly. "Hi," Audrey answered, feeling her cheeks grow warm. A quiet, awkward moment passed between them. They had confronted a murderer together, escaped from bodyguards, and destroyed a high society wedding. But now, in this peaceful garden, they struggled to find words. Finally, Nico broke the silence. "I have been thinking a lot about everything that happened, about you and about me." "About you?" Audrey asked, surprised. "You saved me, Audrey," Nico said, his gray eyes looking directly into hers. "Not just from Veronica, but from the person I had become, from the darkness that had consumed me for 2 years. You gave me a reason to live again, to want to be a better man." He took a slow breath. "I am starting a new community center. It is for kids like Tommy and for families that need support. I am calling it Hope House." "That sounds incredible," Audrey said with a smile. "I need someone to manage it," Nico continued. "Someone with a good heart, someone who understands what it means to struggle and survive, someone like you." "Me?" Audrey shook her head. "But I am just—" Nico moved closer and took her hand. This time, it was not an emergency. He held her hand simply because he wanted to. "You are not just anything, Audrey. You are the most courageous person I know." He paused, his voice softening, "and I was hoping you might give me a chance for us to get to know each other, not as my employee, just as me." Audrey looked into his gray eyes. They felt like a warm fire on a cold night. She smiled. "I would like that." "Hey, are you two going to play or not?" Tommy shouted from the yard. Nico and Audrey both laughed. Hand in hand, they turned and walked toward the boy who was waiting with the ball. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the little garden, the cozy house, and the three of them playing catch, their laughter filling the air. They did not need supercars or mansions. They had a small home, quiet evenings, and a love that was just starting to grow. Audrey had risked everything to help a stranger. She did it not for wealth or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. And Nico discovered that true strength was not found in a criminal empire, but in the courage to release the past and find himself. Sometimes the person who saves us does not come from high society. Sometimes a hero comes dressed in a simple maid's uniform. This story is a reminder that bravery is not about wealth or position. It comes from the human heart. It often just takes one ordinary individual who is willing to do the right thing to change the course of a life. And real love is not about perfection. It is about being sincere and courageous enough to make sacrifices for another. We want to thank you for joining us on this journey. How did this story resonate with you? In your own life, have you known someone like Audrey? Someone who would risk it all for someone else with no expectation of reward? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. We would love to hear from you. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to our channel, give it a like, and share it with your friends and family so we can continue to bring you more powerful stories each day. We wish everyone watching this video a life filled with health, happiness, and peace. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in our next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and inspiration to our audience.